welcome to Grandmaster's Choice. I am Woman Grandmaster Thalia Cervantes, and I'll be covering this class today. And the topics that I have, I think, are quite interesting, quite dynamic. I have two games from the Najdorf, kind of showcasing the aggressive nature of the opening and some of the ideas that Black can have to win with the Najdorf. I don't know, both games kind of gave me this very similar vibe. I've talked a lot in the past in some of my other lectures about the importance of recognizing patterns in chess, right? And how you can use an idea in one game that you saw for your own games later. And this is very interesting because the first example that I want to show is from a game that I played in Spain. I just came back from two tournaments, Open in Menorca and Open Formentera. And overall, I had a really nice experience in those tournaments. My highlight was drawing Ivanchuk in a classical game, so that's a memory that I'm going to have forever. But the last game of my last tournament, basically, as I was playing it, it kind of resembled a previous game that I played, so I thought we would go through that today, right? Because it's always very important not only looking at patterns within your own games, but at the same time, in the process of analyzing those games, trying to see if you can make any correlations in the way that you play, what you need to improve, or what your strengths are, right? So the first game that I want to show started off with e4 c5. I'm playing against a 2100 rated opponent, but I believe he had been having a great tournament up until this point. Knight f3 d6, d4 c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6, and now a very peculiar move, queen to d3. I don't know if anyone has seen this move while playing with the Najdorf, or maybe if you play with the white pieces. I don't know if this is the move that you choose to play in the Najdorf. I personally had not faced it before. I had seen it, but I don't think I've ever had a game with it before this point. And the very interesting thing is that I'm pretty sure my opponent had done some prep here, right? Because it makes a lot of sense. Najdorf is a very concrete opening, right? You usually don't play based on feelings. You just have to memorize certain variations, otherwise you might lose in like 15 moves, right? So I'm pretty sure that my opponent had done some preparation in this line. And admittedly, this round was at 9 a.m. So I was not doing much preparation. I think I looked at some of my opponent's games very briefly beforehand, but I had not done any deep analysis, right? And certainly I had not looked at queen to d3. However, I tried to make moves that seem natural, right? And this is a very healthy advice for whenever you're getting yourself into a position that you don't particularly know, right? Try to associate it to another position that might be similar, that you have seen in the past, and then that you remember some of the ideas, right? Compared to see if they work here. If they don't, what are the similarities? What are the differences? And alongside that, just try to make moves that make sense, right? Like make some sort of developing move or moves that fight for space, fight for initiative. You can't be too passive either. So after queen to d3, I thought, okay, well, the queen just developed, right? Usually the queen doesn't develop so early. Maybe it's a sign that I should go after it, right? And I should start attacking it. So I decided to go knight to d7, and my idea is to eventually play knight to c5, gain a tempo on the queen, and at the same time put some pressure on this pawn on e4. Seemed very natural to me, and it's a completely fine move. Bishop to e2, knight to c5, queen to e3, because the pawn needs to be protected. And now it's another time, right, where I can kind of make a decision. I didn't particularly want to play with something like, let's say, g6. This is probably fine. I'm not saying that it's a terrible move or anything, but I just didn't want to allow the possibility of e5, right? Because it does look a little bit scary, just kind of allowing something like this. We may have some issues in the future, and then if the e file opens up, white can castle. They can bring a rook to e1, they can bring a rook to d1. So I just kind of didn't want to risk it. And in my head, it made a lot more sense to actually just play with e5, right? We just finished gaining a tempo on the white queen, and now we can gain a tempo on the knight on d4, right? Which is another very active piece that white has in this moment. And now basically it becomes a battle of who gets control of the d5 square, right? Because the one thing of playing e5 is that I'm creating weakness on d5 forever, right? So the question is, can white make use of this square? So far I have this defender on f6, right? So it's not a huge deal. But kind of just like a brief question or of, you know, like understanding of the position. How would you guys continue here? Or like what would you do with the knight on c5, right? You have the option to take, you have the option to go back. You have the option to just, to just develop and not do anything. What seems like an idea that you would play here? Also, yeah, hi to the people in the chat. I haven't been on stream for some time, but nice to be here. But yeah, what would you play? Okay, we have one suggestion for bishop e7. Any other ideas? Bishop e7 is one move. The one thing that I'm concerned about is like in the future something like here, and then maybe knight takes c5, d takes c5, and it might seem like this is a improvement in the position because we no longer have the backwards pawn on d6. But at the same time, I am concerned in the future that the king castles, and then the rook goes to d1, putting pressure on the queen, and then the square of d5 like becomes an outpost for the knight, right? So. Like, usually these changes in structures don't quite work. Also, I believe in this particular case, there's like queen g3, and this might be a big problem, right? Take the knight to create double pawns. Yeah, white has double pawns here, but at the same time, is it actually a problem for black, right? Because for white, because now the a file is open, so I can't really play b5, right? Because then there might be either knight takes b5 or bishop takes b5 because of this pin. So if I can play b5 quickly, then I'm not exactly sure what my plan is going to be on the queen side, right? So it's kind of a question that I had in the position, and I wasn't sure how to answer. Bishop to e6, I think, was another move that was suggested. Bishop to e6 is probably like all right, but I'm still a little bit concerned about this because I can't properly develop the bishop from f8, and then e5 might become a weakness. So I could play with b6 in that scenario, but then a6 might be a weakness as well. What do you guys think about knight to e6? Does this make sense at all or no? I feel like I'm gonna have to sneeze at some point, but we'll see. Does knight e6 make sense? Do we not like it? I know that it's not super typical in the Sicilians, but it can be interesting, right? What do you guys think? I mean, it doesn't run into the problem of like trading on b3 and opening up the a file. At the same time, you know, it doesn't go backwards to d7. Yeah, I mean, we're moving the same knight, right? But at the same time, the knight is finding a nice square. Like the knight has the possibility to jump over to f4 at some point, take away the bishop pair from white, And at the same time, our plan is very clear. We're going to play bishop e7, we're going to castle, probably play b5, bishop b7. The fact that the e6 square is not available for the bishop is not a huge deal. On the other hand, we also have ideas of like knight f4, bishop e6, if you do want to put the bishop there. So there are a lot of different choices. Yeah, the knight had a journey from b8 to d7 to c5 to e6, right? But it's kind of finding its footing, and at the same time I thought it was interesting in some future, like if the bishop goes to e7, this knight could maybe get out of the way and I can play bishop to g5, like if knight d5 happens, something like takes and then the bishop coming to b5, I thought that could be interesting. So there are a lot of ideas in this particular position. Knight to e6 might not be the most conceptual move, but it does make sense in this particular case, right? And then if we look at the white pieces, you know, there are small things that don't make sense, like the queen on e3, right? If the queen wasn't here, the knight to f4 wouldn't be a threat, so you just kind of have to adjust to the position. But actually knight to e6 is fine. And my opponent played bishop d2, right? The idea is to clearly castle long, and at some point, you know, kind of have some sort of breakthrough in the center and go after my king. Also, when the king castles long, the rook ends up on d1, and it's gonna put some pressure on this file where my queen is, right? So there are a lot of small insights that I need to pay attention to. But I thought it was fine. Bishop to e7, castles, and I played b5. Right? I realized, okay, if my opponent committed to castling long, I need to start an attack somehow. And usually this is the moment, right, where we jump from opening to middle game, right? It's a very subtle switch, but at the same time, it's kind of the moment where you start planning everything, right? Like you start putting all of the pieces together, and then you realize, okay, most of my pieces are developed. They have this and those routes to go to in the future, and I need these pieces to get involved. I need to get these pieces from those inferior squares to this superior squares, right? And I also need to keep in mind like few tactical ideas in case they ever come up, right? So it's kind of that process of deeply trying to set up the game for the next 10 moves or so. When is this game from? It's from April 19th. Yeah, like 11 days ago. So, yeah. But okay, b5 is a move that was just played. And my opponent played knight to d5, right? And this position, this move changes the kind of the setup of the position, because now I have the option to capture, and then the pawn structure changed. I would say that this move knight to d5 is not a big problem, because after knight takes, pawn takes, like what happened in the game, the d file is closed, right? So I'm never going to have problems with this pawn on d6, which is a backwards pawn. But at the same time, white is gaining a tempo on this knight on e6. However, this was the idea all along, knight to f5, attacking both this pawn and the bishop, I guess this pawn as well, if you have no fear. But after knight to f4, queen to f3 was played. And now knight takes e2, queen takes e2, and the question is how to proceed, right? Like, how would you continue in this position? We have many different ideas, right? Like I said, it's a middle game, so you're kind of setting up all of your plans, making sure that all of your pieces are active and seeking the initiative. So in this particular scenario, we have different plans, right? Like you can either play with castles, you can play with something like f5, bishop to f5, to get the rook to c8. You have different ideas. You also have to pay attention to what white wants, right? Something like either bishop to a5 or knight to a5, knight c6. Maybe something like rook e1 and f4, right? Having a break in the center since the king is still on e8. So it's a good moment to stop, I would say. This is a critical moment in the position where you need to really figure out what your strategy is, because it might end up determining the rest of the game. So I would give you guys maybe like a minute or two to think about this position and what you would play with the black pieces. What do you think I did?
By any chance, did you move forward your second pawn on the left pawn number? I'm sorry.
Which one? This one?
The one that's down here.
This one?
Yes.
Do you want to move it?
I was wondering if that was a move that would be good.
Well, the thing is that we have to keep in mind, kind of like what our strategy is going to be, right? So, in this particular position, first of all, because the kings are on like opposite sides of the board, right? Like my king is here in the center, their king is on the queen side, right? Like if you divide the board in the middle, they're in opposite sides.
Yeah.
We have to first of all play quickly because it's almost like the calm before the storm, right? And then like the action is about to start.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to make sure that we're ready for it, or that we get there first before our opponent.
Okay.
And then on the other hand, we have the option to keep improving our pieces, right? So either this king finally castle it, that's one option, or we can finish our development, right? Because we still have a bishop on c8 that is not out into the attack. And at the same time, maybe this rook that is on a8, we want to put it on an open file, like the c file, right? So like if we get this bishop out of the way, then we can get the rook into the game. So that's kind of like how we are trying to set up the next few moves. So we can do either something that,
Maybe castling.
yeah, castling would be, I think it would be like a fair option in this position. So we can either improve our pieces or create an immediate threat that the opponent needs to take care of before they continue with their own plan, right? And because this is a Sicilian, it's a Najdorf, it's a very aggressive opening, as I was mentioning in the beginning. A lot of times you have like that option of playing a dynamic move that completely disrupts the opponent's position, right? So like it's kind of a mixture of creativity, trying to find those moves, pattern recognition of having that experience of looking at previous games in this opening, or like working this line yourself. Kind of like after you play, you analyze and then you just improve on the variation. Or it's also just like pure calculation, and that's why we always recommend working on tactics and calculation, because it helps with visualizing and kind of like seeing ahead, right? So it's a mixture of all of those things, and it's I'm mentioning again, it's gonna be a crucial moment because you have to determine like which route to take, right?
Yeah.
So castling, I think it's one of the best moves in the position. I think it's completely fine. However, as I was mentioning earlier, white has one idea, right? If they didn't have this idea, I would say that black is better because they have the bishop pair, right? Like two pieces of the same kind against bishop and knight. So the two bishops coordinate together better. But white does have the idea of something like knight to a5, because this c6 square is weak. So the knight is going to get here, it's going to have an outpost, it's going to attack my queen and my bishop. So it disrupts my position for the time being. I still think it's fine. Probably here something like bishop to d7, and then if the knight decides to come, you can take, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that they're going to play knight to c6 right now, but maybe like king to b1, maybe bring the rook here, prepare c4 at some point. It's kind of like a slower plan. Yeah?
Okay. Yeah.
So we can either, go for this, which improves our pieces, right? But we have an opportunity in this particular position that we're not going to have again in the next turn, right? And that's kind of like the tricky thing about this particular position. And when I was playing originally, in my brain, a few moves before, when I was evaluating this position, I was like, okay, I'm gonna be fine. I have castles. Oh, I also have this other idea, which is what I ended up playing. And then when we got here, I was kind of like thinking about that idea slightly deeper. And I realized that, it was completely working. Not just because I calculated, because intuitively it just looks good, right? So it's kind of the move that it's a little bit hard to see, but once you see it, it's like, oh, it makes so much sense, right? Like, why didn't I think of it?
Yeah.
So that's why I say it's like creativity, calculation, recognizing patterns, like mixture of things that helps you understand an opening, or like have a deeper insight into your game.
Right.
There is a suggestion here in the chat for the move a5. a5 has a very clear idea, right? To play a4, attack this knight right here, and the knight doesn't actually have a square to go, so I might need to go to a1, which is a really ugly square for the knight. The only downside of a5 is that the pawn on b5 is hanging, right? Because the pawn on a6 no longer protects b5. How does this move look? Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? Is there like a strategic idea? Is there a like dynamic idea to it? Because it seems like a very mild move, right? It's just like moving the pawn, but there might be some big consequences.
I'm a very immature playing, so I'm just wondering if the white knight could go and take that green pawn
Here?
by jumping over the other piece. I don't think it can it?
This one?
Yes.
Yeah, the knight could take here,
Okay.
but the idea is that we also have two pieces, attacking the square. So after rook takes, we take with the smaller piece first. Bishop takes, queen takes. We have two pieces for one rook, right? That's the difference. And usually the two pieces are better than the rook.
Yeah.
Or in this case, it would be a rook and a pawn, right? But it would be, two pieces. Those are 6 points, 3 plus 3, like in terms of value of the pieces. And then a rook and a pawn would be 5 and 1, so it's 6 anyways. But it's kind of like the power is more evenly distributed when you have the two pieces, and they can coordinate and work better. So you would usually rather have two pieces for a rook.
Yeah.
So usually this type of trades ends up benefiting the person with the two pieces. In that case, it would be me. So when I play a5, I have that in mind, and my position can become really dominant now because I have the bishop pair. And the beautiful thing about those is that they control every square on the board, right? And they will work alongside each other to go on the offense and like control the position. So knight takes a5 is a possibility, but it doesn't really give any big chances to white.
Yeah.
Honestly, I was considering for my opponent to play something like king b1, so that after a4 the knight goes back. And maybe this is a possibility, but again, I just gained like 1-2 tempos. The knight went backwards, and I can still castle. I can still play bishop f5, bring my rook to the open file. I can do all the things that I mentioned before, but now there is no threat of like knight to a5, knight to c6, and my pieces are better. My opponent's pieces are worse, right? Which is exactly what we want. So my opponent decided, okay, like if we're going to go to a crazy position, then let us go there, right? So he played queen takes b5, and now the whole point is that I play bishop to d7, attacking the queen. So the queen is forced to move. White has to take care of the queen first, and they're not going to have enough time to prevent a4. So the thing is that it's kind of like one of those sacrifices that you just do almost intuitively, right? In this particular case, I could calculate that I was going to have a really good position, but you can also just kind of sense it. Like, again, I have the bishop pair, right? My king is in the center, but it's not under any danger because it's impossible to get to it. My opponent's pieces are not active enough, and the center is blocked, right? Like, there's no pawn captures that can be made here or anything. I'm gaining tempos in all of my moves, right? Because I just played a5 with the idea of a4. Now I'm playing bishop d7 with a threat on the queen. I'm going to play a4 with a threat on the knight. All of my moves, I'm gaining tempos. And then on top of that, white just took a pawn on the side of the board where the king is, right? Which means that files are opening up on the side of where their king is at. Which means that I'm going to, in the future, be able to utilize those files, foreshadowing, and I'm going to basically just like go after the king, right? So when you mix up all of those things and all of that reasoning for just giving up one pawn, it seems very intuitive because you're just like, oh, I'm gaining so many things that it just makes sense. And in this particular position, my opponent didn't really have much to do. I was considering maybe he could play like queen b7 and then after a4, knight to a5. But we still have this idea, right? Takes, queen b8, giving a check. And I don't want to go bishop d8 because then my pawn on d6 is hanging. But I can just play queen d8, right? And my position's completely fine. I still have 2 pieces for the rook. And it's going to be a winning endgame for black. The position is at about like -3. So that's not a possibility, and queen b7 is kind of the most aggressive move that white has. So the queen ended up going backwards, queen to d3. And now very obvious, a4, knight to a1. And here I realized, okay, I have the open position. I'm going to have pieces into the game. But I just want to finish my coordination, right? So it makes sense to go for castles right now. And I'm eventually going to get my queen out of the way, bring the rook over to the open files, right? Like maybe I can put one rook here and then the other one here. I have some interesting ideas. And then with castles, I also support maybe like f5, f4, or like f5, e4, and then my bishop can get into this diagonal. It just seems like my position just flows very naturally and I don't have to think too deeply, right? Like my pieces just by nature are going to start finding their squares. Bishop to e6 was played. And now queen to c7. Queen to c7. I think with bishop to e6, the bishop to e3, one idea that my opponent had was to maybe play c4, right? But what do we do against c4? Like c4 with the idea of knight c2. But what can we do against it? Because one move that seems natural is really bad. And then the other one is really good, so.
Would you move the bishop to the c4 here to challenge it?
Like here?
The blue one. So it's not diagonal, so it's facing the...
Oh.
So it's facing the pawn? Oh, it has to jump over, never mind, okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But we can go here, we can move this bishop, right? And kind of like how the chat is suggesting, bishop to b5 is a really strong move because it kind of makes a pin, right? And because of this queen on c7, the pawn is not able to take. And at the same time, we're putting pressure onto c4, and behind the pawn is the queen, right? So it's impossible to protect this pawn. However, there's a reason why rook fc8 is a really inaccurate move. Can anyone maybe try to think about why that is? It's not that bad. It's not a... I mean, it's still fine for black, but there might be an idea that is a little bit annoying.
Well, it's not as secure.
Bishop to b5 is a little bit more direct, yeah. But yes, as it's being suggested in the chat, also there is this idea of c5, right? And all of a sudden the white pawns are coming towards us, and it can be a little scary because if we decide to take the pawn, get rid of it, there's d6, right? And then there's like this double threat, and the queen and the rook support d6. So it can end up being very damaging for us, and all of a sudden we go from attacking to our opponent being the one attacking, so it can be very dangerous. But c4 doesn't work because of bishop to b5, thankfully. And it's not really luck, it's more of just the way that the game has gone, right? Like, I keep putting my pieces in good squares, I have a little bit more space in the position, my moves are bound to work, right? It just kind of makes sense. But instead of c4, oh, I guess I didn't save properly the rest of the game. But instead of c4, my opponent played with c3, right? Yeah, usually you should play king to b1, but in this particular position, it doesn't make much of a difference. And then you're also running into some dangers, right? Because you don't have the light square bishop. So you might run into some troubles either with like g6 or f5, f4. f5 with the idea of f4, and then you open up the square for the bishop on f5. So there are a lot of dangers in this position. I decided to play rook fc8. And my opponent played the very natural knight to c2, right? And then, you know, in some positions sometimes, especially in the middle game or when you have the initiative, when you're attacking, when there are, you know, interesting things going on in the position, you start kind of like putting the pieces together, right? Or like you start kind of brewing something. And in this particular case, I was thinking about my position and I was like, I must have something here. Let me see if I can like set up a tactic for my opponent, right? Because again, all of my pieces are very nicely placed. I have my rooks on really strong files. This one is on the C file. This one may support A3 at some point, right? If not, then it can always go to the B file and it's going to be really strong here as well. My light square bishop is never going to be challenged, right? Because white doesn't have a light square bishop. And then this bishop on e7 is not doing too much right now. It usually just like stays calm on e7, protecting d6. But who knows, in some future maybe it can do something. It can maybe go to f6. This opens up and then it controls this diagonal. It's just not its time right now, but it's not a bad piece at all, right? So I thought, okay, all of my pieces are kind of doing something. I have the files, I have the space, I have the initiative. Let me set up a trick for my opponent to fall into, right? So what could be a really dynamic move here for black, kind of keeping that in mind. And again, this particular thought of trying to set up tricks for the opponent is what really reminded me of the game that I want to show after this one. It's from a few years ago, back when I was younger and, well, not more talented, just younger. But I'm not gonna roast myself either. But yeah, anyway, it's a game with like kind of similar ideas in the Sicilian, trying to set up a trap for your opponent to fall into, right? Yeah, I see a lot of interesting ideas in the chat, and I do agree with them. First of all, we have to realize what the opponent might want to do, right? So if they put a knight on a3, or if they play something like a3, knight b4, it might get annoying because all of a sudden the queen side might get blocked, right? And what we want is for the position to be open, right? So we can attack the king. So that's something slightly concerning. Like, for example, I was considering rook b8 during the game, which is still fine, but I wasn't sure what to do after like a3, rook b3, knight b4. I assumed that it was going to be winning somehow, but I wasn't exactly sure, right? Meanwhile, this other move that I played was very straightforward, which is a3, right? Which is suggested in the chat. However, when I played a3, I calculated the full variations, right? So can someone tell me what's going to happen if pawn takes or knight takes? Because, you know, yeah. Well, if they take with pawn or if they take with knight.
If they take the pawn, yeah. If the pawn tries to take it, or if the knight tries to take it, your rook could take their whatever it is they're trying to take. I mean, trying to take a3. Excuse me.
Yeah, but there's a subtle difference. Like if they take with a knight, and the knight is a bigger piece, right?
Yes.
So if we get rid of the knight, that's a really good thing. If they take with the pawn, I don't think we can take with the rook because it's just a pawn, right? And then the knight will still be alive to protect the king.
Okay.
But for example, if pawn takes, there are other moves that we can play. My opponent ended up taking with the knight in the game, so we'll discuss that after. But I just want to focus on ba3 right now. So, any ideas as of what to do here? Okay, we have queen a5 probably. I think queen a5 is probably the move that I would have played in my game. Queen a5 is an idea. Bishop to a4 is an idea. Probably even queen takes c3 works, but I don't want to do it just now because after queen takes c3, queen takes, rook takes, the position is probably still fine. But I don't need to trade queens. I'm the one with the attack, so it doesn't make sense for me to get rid of my most powerful piece, right? But yeah, these moves are kind of interesting. Another move that I think is very curious, actually, is bishop to f6. Because my idea is very simple. I want to play e4, and then I want to take here somehow, right? And then all of a sudden, the piece that was doing nothing before is one of the most active pieces in the position. So it's really interesting how all of my pieces can work together. For this attack, and basically like I'll just have every single piece that I have attacking c3. This queen is bound to defending the pawn. It can't really go away even if I set up distractions like e4. So even just by looking at this position, it just looks extremely uncomfortable for white, right? Because their king is open. All of the files around the king are open. I have the bishop pair, once again. How many times am I going to say that in this video? But it's a really powerful thing, and I think you can sense it too. And also, again, the fact that this bishop on d7 is completely unrivaled because white doesn't have a counterpart for it, right? So we have all of these ideas. I'm just going to make even more arrows so that, everyone can see. Isn't this beautiful? But yeah, so b takes a3, obviously the position looks really bad, and actually after bishop to f6, even though we're 2 pawns down, it's -4, so it's completely winning for black. However, my opponent actually, surprisingly fast, in fact, decided to take with knight takes a3. I was a little bit shocked. After I played a3, admittedly, I was just like walking around, maybe getting a snack or two because, again, we had a 9 a.m. game and I hadn't eaten anything by this point. So, yeah, knight takes a3. My opponent played surprisingly fast, and I thought that he clearly had not calculated the idea that I had for this position. So instead of asking you how you would continue here, on more strategical terms, this particular case is more like black to play and win, right? Because we have everything ready to finally strike, right? And it's the moment to execute our tactic. So what can we do? And remember, we always look at the forcing moves, right? Checks, captures, and threats in that particular order. And like I said, the thing that's worrying about knight takes e3 is the fact that we can now take this knight, and the knight was a key defender of the king, so we can get rid of it, right? But at the same time, we also need to have concrete variations, right? Because we just gave up 2 pawns. We can't just give up an exchange and not have a proper, conclusion to the attack, right? So, if you're going to suggest a move, I would say suggest the whole line. Also, welcome, Chesweed. Seeing that you guys are starting to piece everything together, yeah? Like, someone suggests a move, and then another one suggests a move, and then you're like, wow, it makes so much sense when you put them together. Yeah, it's a very sad horse in the corner of the board. Maybe we should end its suffering. Yeah, it's gonna be a sad king as well. Would you go for it? Rook takes a3. Yeah, it feels like it should work, right? That's kind of the start of variations. A lot of times, right? You're like, it should work. So rook takes a3. Obviously, b takes a3 is the only move that makes sense. And now it's the crucial part, right? Because we already have the queen and the rook lined up here on c3, but we want to stop the queen from protecting this pawn, right? That way we can enter with our own queen and deliver checkmate. So how do we distract this queen on d3?
Do you move your bishop?
Yeah.
To then make a move?
Here? Yeah, that's great. Bishop to f5, and then we're attacking the queen. And at the same time, our bishop is gaining space in this diagonal. You kind of see the theme of this game that step by step, we're trying to improve our position, right? So even if we give up material, we gave up a pawn at the start to improve our pieces, get more space, and force the white knight to get to a1. And then we gave up another pawn on a3 to open up files, right? And basically improve our pieces. And then now we're finally, doing like one last sacrifice to improve our bishop, right? Going to f5. And it's basically impossible to stop all of the threats. So the problem is that if queen takes f5, we have queen takes c3. The only move, well, I guess you can go queen c2, but then we take it and it's checkmate. And then after king b1, we have rook b8, right? And it's checkmate as well. So bishop to f5, the queen cannot take it. My opponent decided to play queen to d2. And if bishop to b6, which I think is like a last resort, trying to distract my own queen so that it takes, I think probably the best continuation is just bishop to b5. And basically we have too many threats going on that it's impossible, for white to keep an eye on everything. Again, the beauty of the two bishops, right? When they work together side by side, they just control the entire, side of the board. So bishop b6 is not possible, and then my opponent ended up playing queen to d2. But here we have a very killer move. That just kind of makes one last threat and shuts down the position. We keep on improving our pieces.
So do you promote it? Do you promote your bishop? Is that what you would do?
Well, not the bishop in this case. We can utilize the fact that, we gave up the rook on the A file on A3, and then we open up the B file. So we can utilize the B file for our. Is that a cop car? Yeah, sorry. We can utilize the B file to make some threats.
Yeah.
I think there is more than like one winning move in this position. Probably queen a5 is really strong as well. But actually queen a5 there might be like king b2 and then the king hides on a1.
Do you think it would be worth it to sacrifice your pawn that's next to your bishop so that your bishop will take the other bishop?
do you mean, like this one?
Yes.
But it goes forward, so it gets in the way of my bishop.
I was suggesting that if they were to take your pawn, like they were to like fall for it basically, you'll take their bishop and it still clears the way.
But what do you mean, like take my pawn? Because the bishop goes like that.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a little tricky sometimes. Yeah, the bishop's only diagonal, the pawn only take diagonal. So it's a it's a little confusing. But we want the bishop open.
Right.
And we want the b file open. And wow, they both connect on b1, right? And if we bring a piece to b1, it might be checkmate. So rook to b8, as the chat is suggesting, kind of seals the deal, right? And the whole point is that we're going to play rook b1 next turn, right? Which is checkmate. And this queen basically has no places to go because it has the job of protecting c3, and it also needs to move away so that the king has escape route to d2, but it's impossible to do all of that, right? And even though we have less pieces than our opponents, we have less material, all of our pieces are better placed, right? All of our pieces have a purpose, they have a threat, and it's impossible for white to stop it. The game actually continued a few more moves, but the position is completely winning. My opponent ended up giving up the queen with queen to b2. And then after takes, I think it was like queen b7, king a1, queen a6. Queen a6. Not bishop. Yeah, bishop c1, queen c4, f3. Queen takes c3, bishop b2, queen a5, rook to e1. Yeah, rook to e1, and now bishop to c7, rook to c1, bishop g5. This endgame is completely winning, but now we also have an extra tactic to win. And yeah, the game finished after rook takes, queen takes e1, bishop c1, and do not fall for background checkmate, just h6, right? And here my opponent resigned. I mean, it was impossible to protect everything with the queen going around, but yeah, the game ended here. And funnily enough, my opponent said something like, my opponent said something like, oh, I missed bishop e5. If it wasn't for bishop f5, I think I'm doing okay. Well, the whole point is that I have bishop f5. I don't know exactly if e4 works, but yeah, the point is that thankfully this tactic works. And it's nice because I set up all of this, right? Like way ahead in the game before it happened. So even when I was playing like queen c7, rook c8, I was thinking about ideas of a3. I was just waiting for that moment that it could work, right? And then finally, it ended up working in this position because I just have way too many threats and it's impossible for my opponent to take care of all of them. And then soon after I finished this game, I realized that, you know, it gave me like very similar vibes to a game that I had in 2017, which I want to show just really quickly. Oops, I wasn't supposed to do that. I was playing with the black pieces as well. It was another Sicilian, and this was at a this is a very interesting game because I was having a tough tournament. It was like a Pan American Youth Championship, and I think I had like 2.5 out of 5 or 2.5 out of 4, something like that. And I wanted to fight for first place, so it wasn't enough. And my mom, I'm a very big pacifist, I don't get into any messes, but my mom was like, oh, just look at your opponent and imagine that it's like the person that you hate the most in this world, and like you solve that anger for your game. And I think I took it a little too seriously. But the game started with e4, c5, knight f3, d6. We got another Najdorf. I've basically been playing this opening my whole life. But in this case, bishop to e2. We still got a setup with e45, right, where the square on d5 matters a lot. Knight to b3, bishop e7, castles, bishop g5. And once again, we have a position in which I get the bishop pair with the black pieces, right? So you can kind of already start seeing like few similarities. In this case, of course, white ended up castling short, but the idea of the attack is going to still be the same. Knight to d5, bishop to g5. I don't want to give up the bishop pair. c4. And basically it becomes a battle between whether the knight on d5 and the control of the square, the strategical advantage that white has, is it enough, or can I, with the bishop pair, create a dynamic initiative in the position, and kind of like which one of the two prevails at the end, right? So that's kind of the point of this position. But I think it fits my style, you know, to play with the bishop pair. I love having the bishop pair and kind of like trying to prove a point with the initiative. Knight to d7. My plan is to eventually go knight to f6 and get rid of this knight on d5. And my opponent goes knight to c1, right? It kind of makes sense in some ways because you want to bring the knight over to d3. But at the same time, you have to worry about whether it's too slow or not. Knight to f6 and bishop to f3. So the knight's still on c1. It hasn't moved from there. And now we have takes, bishop f5. I resolved an issue in my position. The d file is closed. d6 is not a weakness anymore. Again, kind of similar a little bit to the previous game, right? Like my opponent's knight went to d5 and I got rid of it. Bishop to g4. We repeat it once and then takes, f5, right? So now I have these two pawns. I don't have the bishop pair anymore, but I have my dark square bishop. And I have slightly more active pieces, right? Because there is a knight stuck on c1. And not only is it back in the first rank, but also it blocks the connection between the rooks, right? And I'm gonna try and make moves with tempo on every turn so that I force my opponent to react to my threats instead of finishing their development and finishing the coordination of the pieces, right? Which is a little bit similar to the previous game, the idea with a5, a4, pushing the opponent's pieces backwards. The knight went back to the first rank. I don't want to give my opponent enough time to recover, right? Queen to d1 was played, and now f4. This is actually a very risky move because if the pawns get blocked like this, the knight might be better than my bishop because I just put my pawns in the same color as my bishop, so it's taking away its control. And at the same time, if the center closes, the knight becomes better than the bishop, right? But thankfully I have some ideas, and of course if f3 in this position, there's queen b6 with threats both on the king and the pawn on b2. It was a tough move to make, honestly, but I ended up playing it. So queen to f3. However, one thing that we know is that the queen is not made for defense, right? The queen is made for the offense. If you defend with the queen, it's very easy to go after it, you know, and attack it because you have to react whenever there's a threat to the queen, right? It's not like you can ignore it like a pawn or something. You have to react to the queen. And again, similarly to last game, the queen was the one piece preventing the checkmates going on for the time being against the opponent's king. So queen to f3, queen to b6, attacking this pawn. And back when I played f4, I realized, okay, I have some tactical ideas. My queen is gonna go to b6, right? It has like some long diagonals. And I'm gonna set up this trick, right? So queen to b6. My opponent played b3, again has to react to my threats. It doesn't have time to do what it wants. So how should we continue here as black to keep that going? We need to keep playing active, keep making threats, keep doing things.
Could you possibly move the rook to face the knight as well to just
Like, you mean like here?
Yeah.
But the pawn is in the way, so I'm not like directly attacking the knight. This rook is gonna get involved in the game at some point, but we first have to make an open file for it to go to. Like, for example, in the chat, there is a suggestion for rook to e8 with the idea of moving the pawn to e4, like the rook will support the pawn.
That makes sense.
But at the same time, if I play rook to e8, I might be a little slow because white can fight for the control of e4 because before I make the break. So I need to make the break before that, right? And then I'm gonna go e4.
Okay.
I'm going after the queen, so they have to react.
Have to.
Queen takes. And now that the file is open, there is rook to e8. And again, it's a situation in which I give up a pawn, but it just makes so much sense, right? So, like, I gave up a pawn, but I brought all of my pieces into the attack.
Yeah.
And I'm going to keep putting pressure on my opponent for the next 5-10 moves, right? I don't even know if the game made it 10 moves further, but rook to e8, right? Did I play rook to e8? Oh, sorry. If I play rook to e8, there's gonna be queen to f3. So maybe before rook e8, I just need to play f3 first, right? That was my ban. I can't remember my own games. I'm getting too old. But okay, so I'm playing f3 first because I don't want the queen to even go back to f3. So it's just kind of like keep opening up the position even more, right? And the whole issue with this for white is that they are not going to have enough time to react and take care of all of the threats at the same time, right? Because after f3, it's actually very difficult to make moves, right? Because if you take, then all of a sudden the position opens up. It's kind of similar to when we played a3, and then we said that if the pawn takes it, then like the pawns are too dispersed and files are opening up. So it would be kind of like that if pawn takes rook to e8, and then the position is a little bit more tricky, right? There are less pieces, but it's still very uncomfortable for white. And my opponent actually played with g3. Now, after g3, we do have rook to e8, queen to g4. And here I think it was here. Here is when I was cooking up some things. And I realized, okay, I have a really strong position. I have a pawn on f3 that dominates a lot of the squares around the king. I have a rook on the open file. I have another rook supporting this pawn. My bishop can sneak into the position, right? Because all of the white pawns on the king side are fixed on the same color as my bishop. And my queen is far away, but it's still looking towards the king, right? And another thing that I realized as I was playing this game is that my opponent was playing incredibly fast. Like every single move, it was basically to the touch, right? So I was thinking, this makes for the perfect opportunity for me to set up a tactic, right? Like to set up a trap a few moves ahead that my opponent has no idea about, and I can win the game that way. Kind of similarly to that a3. Someone is saying you did not play bishop e3. That's true. I did not play bishop e3. I don't think that's a good move. Maybe it's fine. I don't know. But it's not the move that I played. I had a different idea. Actually, I'm wondering, like bishop to e3. Maybe there's knight d6 because there's not like immediate threat here on f2. So maybe this gives the tempo to white. But no, I had a different idea. I played with bishop to f6. Makes a lot of sense. Keep making threats on every move. Rook to b1 is the only choice. And here I played h5. You might be thinking, what kind of move is this? h5, completely on the other side of the board, right? But again, the whole point is that we try to improve our pieces and at the same time make our opponent's pieces go to worse squares. And kind of similarly in last game, how we said that the queen is the one piece that's holding the position together for white. in this case, we also need to attack the queen because it's the piece that's kind of preventing the downfall for white, right? And at face value, h5 looks like a very strange move. But I had my plan. I had my plan, and yeah, I was kind of just trusting in the fact that it would work, because my opponent also seemed to be playing this position a little too fast. Now, in this particular case, queen takes f3 is the best move, but it's a very dangerous move to make because there is bishop to d4, and then, you know, all of a sudden there are a lot of threats, right? Both on the queen on f3, pawn on f2, I have control over this file. It just looks very scary. Like, I think probably the best continuation is something like that. Or maybe not, because then there's rook f2. Like, the position just looks really, really tough to play. So that's if queen takes f3. But my opponent ended up playing queen takes h5, right? And then what was the point of all of this? I like how someone says, I wouldn't want to be one of your pawns. I mean, yeah, you're probably gonna get sacrificed at some point.
If they go that way, it's easier for them to get eaten up. So it's just like, I don't understand. Like, I feel like the other move would have been better for them. Or at least
Yeah,
mine,
the other move would have been better, but this almost feels like, oh, what's even the change? The queen on g4 versus the queen on h5, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there is a very big change, right? And we always look at checks, captures, and threats. Checks first. Chess lover in the chat has got it. But yeah. We actually have a checkmate idea, so I'm gonna give you that hint.
Okay. Because it kind of feels that way. It feels like it's a
Yeah, it feels like there should be something, right?
Yeah, because I feel like even if you're trying to move your pawn up two pieces, the queen takes it, bishop takes the queen, and it's ugly. It's ugly from there.
So what is the one check that we have in this position? It's kind of long range, but we get there.
Mm-hmm. It seems too straightforward, but I'm gonna try. Like the queen taking the pawn, then the rook taking that, taking the queen, and then the rook goes up and then captures the king.
Yeah, we have this move, right? Queen takes f2, which is a completely crazy move, right? Because you can take either with the king or with the rook.
Yeah.
But the thing is that the white pieces are so distracted that it actually works. So first of all, king takes, we have bishop to d4 checkmate.
Yeah.
And that's why we needed the queen away from g4 and into h5, because otherwise it would take here on d4. So that was my whole point when I was playing h5. Actually, even before, because my move before that was bishop to f6. I was forced to move the bishop. The whole point is that at some point I need the queen to get away from g4 so that I can play queen takes f2, right? Because otherwise this wouldn't work. And like you said, if the rook takes, the rook goes all the way down, right? And it attacks the king. The only move to prevent the back rank checkmate, which by the way is due to this knight on c1 many moves ago. If the knight wasn't here, this wouldn't be possible at all. So the only move would be rook to f1, and then now we have bishop to d5. The king can go up, it's a check, only square is going to h1, and then rook takes f1, right? And that would be checkmate. So it's very crazy, but we managed to completely break through the position of the white king, and everything works because all of the white pieces are so dispersed, right? There's absolutely no coordination between them, and it's a little bit similar to the previous game in which we managed to break through because the white pieces were not coordinated, and there's, for some reason, a knight stuck in the first rank, right? It's kind of like, you know that meme that is like, if I had a penny for every time that I won a game because my opponent's knight stuck in the first rank, blocking the coordination, I would have 2 pennies, which is not enough, but it's weird that it happened twice, yeah? That's so dumb. But it worked, right? Yes, and yeah, it's crazy that a move like queen to f2 works, but I was kind of thinking about it. Like a few months before, and someone in the chat is asking about queen takes f3, which I did briefly analyze, but we actually have bishop to d4, and then there's a lot of pressure on f2, right? If the queen goes to g2, there is going to be rook takes f2 because of this back rank idea once again. But if the queen goes to d1, I think something like bishop to f2, king g2. I think the position is close to equal, but in my opinion, it looks a little scary for white, especially if I play something like queen e3 with some ideas of queen to e4. I think it might be difficult. Also, we have h4, h3 ideas, so there's more than enough compensation, right, for the material that we gave up. But yeah, thankfully, my opponent ended up taking on h5, and then we had a really beautiful move, queen takes f2, and here she resigned. And this game gave me a lot of confidence for the rest of the tournament. I made a very big comeback, and I ended up getting 3rd place in the event, which opened a lot of doors for me because top 3 places at the Pan American Youth often get conditions for when you play World Youth, and at the time that financial help was really meaningful to me, and then I went to play World Youth, and I had a pretty good result. It was in Greece. It was a great tournament, and yeah, so that was a really nice opportunity. I feel like, again, it has to do with like this game and the confidence that it gave me. And when I played the other game like not too long ago, it kind of just it kind of just reminded me of that other game from 2017. So that's why I say it's always nice to try and find patterns, not just in chess, but in life in general, and see if there's anything that you can learn from them, if there's something that you are naturally better at, if there are some things that you need to work on. It's kind of all based on patterns, right? And especially when I go home and analyze my games from tournaments, like I said, I just finished playing in Spain and I have a total of 19 games from 2 tournaments. When I go back, not only do I analyze my games individually and try to figure out like, oh, in this game I made a mistake here, in that game I made a mistake there, but it's also about, you know, kind of understanding it as a whole and finding some correlation, like, oh, I had an issue in this opening, or I did better in this type of endgame compared to that type of endgame, or I noticed that I played, you know, better, I managed my time better in this tournament than in the other one, and it's just kind of like trying to figure out what the patterns are. Yeah, so I think that's gonna be all for today. Thank you so much for being here. I hope it was insightful and that the 2 games were fun. Thank you. And yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna have any other streamed lectures, but you know, it's always a pleasure having this crowd. So yeah, thank you so much everyone for being here. And that's all.